Hi, I'm Gareth Green, and in this video we're going to be thinking about the interpretation of the Intermezzo in B minor by Brahms, Opus 119, number 1, composed in 1893, and we're talking about a collection of this Klavierstück intermezzos that were the last of Brahms's piano compositions. So quite interesting from that point of view. And I just wanted to read you something that I think is really relevant to the interpretation of a piece, and this one in particular. And it just flags up this thing about, when we're going to play a piece and we want to think about interpretation, it's obviously tempting to get straight to the music and think about what's going on and the melody and the harmony and so on. But it's always worth just thinking out, is there any background information that is relevant? Like, was the piece dedicated to somebody in particular? Does that have any relevance in terms of the interpretation? What was the occasion for which a piece might have been written? What do we mean by titles like intermezzo? It's kind of suggesting it's sort of fairly brief, short piece coming in between something else. What's going on? Is there any background that will help us with the interpretation? Well, how about this? Because this is something that Brahms wrote to Clara Schumann in a letter in 1893, and it's all about this piece. Let me just read you this. This is what he wrote to Clara Schumann. I'm tempted to copy out a small piano piece for you because I would like to know how you agree with it. It is teeming with dissonances. So that's telling us something, isn't it? Even Brahms here, it's teeming with dissonances, exclamation mark, he writes. So even by Brahms' standard, he's obviously thinking this is a pretty dissonant piece. So we need to look at those dissonances and think, what does this mean? Okay, back to his letter. These may well be correct and can be explained, but maybe they won't please your palate. So he's obviously a bit worried about whether Clara's going to like this piece. And now I wish they would be less correct, but more appetizing and agreeable to your taste. The little piece is exceptionally melancholic, and to be played very slowly is not an understatement. So you see, we're learning things about the mood of the piece before we even look at it, aren't we? Melancholic, so it's got to have a kind of underlying sadness about it. So that suggests all sorts of things, doesn't it? About dynamic levels, about speed, about how we engage with the melody and with the harmony of the piece. They're already firing up ideas, hopefully. And the fact that he says to be played very slowly. Okay, it says adagio, but what does adagio mean? And it's obviously slow, but very slowly. That's really helping us to think, actually, what's the kind of slowest working speed we might discover for this piece that might be in line with what Brahms had in mind? Let's read on because it gets even more interesting. This is what Brahms writes next in this letter to Clara Schumann. Every bar and every note must sound like a ritardando, as if one wanted to suck melancholy out of each and every one, lustily and with pleasure, out of these very dissonances. Good Lord, says Brahms, this description will surely awaken your desire. It's kind of funny style of writing, isn't it? But he's obviously wanting Clara Schumann to be really engaged and enthusiastic. And she responds and says she's very enthusiastic about it and can't wait for him to send the other pieces in this set. But isn't that interesting? Every bar and every note must sound like a ritardando. And then he tells us why, because we wanted to suck the melancholy out of each and every note. So every single note has a kind of significance. We can't just think, oh, well, there's just a load of semiquavers, a load of 16th notes, so we'll just get through those and get on to the next note of the melody, because every note has a significance in drawing out this melancholy of the piece. So you see, as a piece of background information, that is a source document from the composer that tells us a huge amount about how we've got to think about this piece. So if we play like this, we're playing the right notes, we're kind of addressing the phrasing, we've kind of played it fairly quietly, but have we done what Brahms is describing in that letter? Absolutely not. Why? It's too fast. We haven't got enough room to soak up this melancholic thing in every bar and every note. He's talking about ritardando with a kind of overdrive. I haven't really done that, have I really? I've kind of motored through those first 4 bars without really stopping for breath. So it can sound all right, it can sound perfectly musical, but is it really in line with what Brahms had in mind? So we learn a great deal from that. Okay, let's just have a little look at what's going on structurally in the initial section, because obviously this is where we begin and we see a double bar line there. So that must be the end of the first section. And it's interesting, of course, that Brahms puts this writ in there. So we mustn't look at that writ and think, well, he means everything else to be strictly in tempo, and then he wants a writ at that point, because he's already told us in that source document that actually we're going to be full of ritardando. It's going to be very flexible. It's giving us permission to really go the extra mile on the rubato. Always a difficult one, because if you really stretch your tempo to the extreme, you get to the point where you actually upset the underlying rhythm, the underlying sense of pulse. So we've got to maintain this 3/8 time signature. We've got to convey the rhythm of this, but we've also got to be very flexible with the tempo. So one thing you notice about this opening section is that actually rhythmically, it's not that complicated. It's not even as complicated as it looks. You know, when you look at it, you sort of think, oh Lord, I've got this tied note here, and then I've got something tied here, and then there's something down there. But really what's going on, something is happening on every single semiquaver or every single 16th note of the music. He's just generating a complete flow of semiquavers, 16th notes. Because he's doing that, we've got more scope to mess around with the tempo, because in fact, if we play it fairly strictly, we're going to get fairly fed up with those semiquavers, those 16th notes. They're going to feel fairly tedious, aren't they? So being flexible with them, he's given us this free flow of these notes so that we can stretch them. So that's a kind of useful thing to spot. Okay, in this first section, there's a phrase that finishes at this point, and then a second phrase that starts from there and takes us to the end of the section. So we've got kind of 2 main statements inside the first section. That's important, because if we're going to use lots of rubato, we also need to know where the structural breathing points are. So this is quite an important point, isn't it? Just to think, that's where we're starting the second main phrase. So we've got this kind of 8-bar phrase, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And then we're starting again, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So actually that's quite regular, isn't it? 2 8-bar phrases. You'll also notice, just by looking at the music, that those 8-bar phrases kind of split up. So you look at the first bar, the first measure, and that sort of looks like a fairly tight 1-bar, 1-measure unit, doesn't it? Because when you look at the next bar, the next measure, you sort of think, well, it's the same design as the first bar, the first measure, isn't it? And then you look at this and you think, well, it's the same kind of design again. When you look at this bar, you think, that's looking slightly different in design, isn't it? We've got more quavers, 8th notes, maybe something a little bit sort of pulling us through the bar there onto the next bar. There's something slightly different about that bar. So sometimes just looking at a score, taking it in visually, you think, I've got 3 bars or 3 measures doing the same kind of thing. Then I've got a bar or measure doing something slightly different that's kind of pulling me into that one. Then this one looks a bit like that one, doesn't it? And then I seem here to have something a bit more continuous going on at the end of the phrase. So we're beginning to sort of break down the phrase and see, what's happening? When we go on, we think, well, look at this one. That's the first bar of the second phrase. It's exactly the same as the first bar of the first phrase. The second bar is exactly the same as that second bar. So you think, it's just going to copy the same thing. Actually, this one is not the same as that one, because this has an A natural, this has an A sharp. So we're kind of moving off in a different direction. this bar sort of looks a bit like this bar, but actually the notes have moved, the pitch is different. And then when you look at that, you think, actually, no, it's not really doing this, is it? So when we get here, we've got this bar being used again, sort of into the last bar. It's not following quite the same shape as the end of that first phrase. So just looking at it before you even think about what it sounds like, you begin to get an idea of, okay, structurally, that's the end of the first section. Break it down, you've got two phrases, 8 bars each. Break it down, what's in common inside each of those two phrases, what's different, how's this structure going into these 1 bar units and so on. So we can kind of gather a lot from that. Okay, well, let's think about this from a melodic point of view. Well, there is a melody running along the top of the texture here. So let's engage with that for a moment. 1, 2, 3, and 1, 2, 3, and 1, 2, 3, and 1, 2, 3. So you see, I've counted that because there's a kind of rhythmic repetition there as well, isn't there? So we've got a long note, and then a quick move at the end of the bar, the end of the measure in bars 1, 2, and 3. Then we go into 4 and suddenly it becomes more continuous. So little fragment, long note, 1 short note, long note, 1 short note, long note, 1 short note. Then we kind of grow into the makings of a phrase. Then what's happening with the line from this point? Well, we're back to a long note with a quick one at the end of the bar, but then more sustained again. And you think, the melody here is the same as it was there, you know, including the B that comes before that. But then we have a big leap to the highest point so far. And now we're back into this long note with a short note to follow. Long note with a short note to follow. That's sequential, so that's worth noting. And then we're into the melody of the second phrase. Okay, well, what's happening melodically in the second phrase? Well, it's all as it was the first time, so nothing new there. All this is the same. This is a transposition, so these 2 notes are 1 note lower than those 2 notes. Bit of rhythm at the end of this bar. Previously we had 3 equal notes. Now we've got this. Ti-dum, na, ti-ti-dum. So it's extending that. And then we get the most extended melodic idea that takes us to the end of the section. So you can sort of see what's going on there. So melody at the top of the texture all the way through. When we interpret this, we've got to think that melody needs some focus. It's very tempting when you play this piece or a piece like it to lose the melody because you've got all these notes going on. So you just hear 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, but we haven't got a sense of this is the melody note going onto this and onto that. So can we give sufficient emphasis to that melody at the top in the balance? So we've got to do something with the balance. It's up to you to decide how much weight you put on the melody, how you back off the stuff underneath. But it's important to know where are your melodic lines. So in this first section, definitely at the top. Now, is there anything going on anywhere else that's melodic? Well, when you look at these first 3 bars, these first 3 measures, we can see what's happening. We've got a melody note, then we're kind of adding these thirds step by step coming underneath it. All that is kind of rhythmic energy. It's all making up chords that gradually accumulate. We'll come back and talk about those in a moment. But then what about this left hand? Because when this left hand comes in here, there's something more melodic going on. And then it's used in sequence here. So third higher, T, and then, you know, we kind of go into bass line a bit, don't we? But there's still something melodic going on there. So from this bar, we've got to think a little bit about some duetting going on between the top and the bottom. And I always think, when you're trying to get to grips with a piece of music, it's always tempting just to sort of play every note in the score. But if we want to focus on what's happening melodically, well, play that melody at the top of the texture all the way through to the end of the first section. Get a notion in your mind as to how does that melody go? How does it feel? Where do I want to allow the phrase to peak? Where do I want it to subside? Am I being faithful to the markings in the score? Where's the highest note? Is that the note of greatest tension? Where's the lowest note? Where do we have moments of repose? So we begin to think out what we're doing with shaping the melody. Then, if there's what you might term to be secondary melodic material, which is what I'm claiming about this bass line, well, actually, how does that go? Play that line on its own. But then duet just the melodic stuff and begin to think, does the left hand want to be as loud as the right hand when it comes in with something melodic, or is it sitting slightly behind the right hand? How are we doing that? So here's our melody. And we might have an idea about how we want to do this with the phrasing, so we can lift at the end of the bars without killing the phrase, and then a phrase across the bar line. But then, how do we get that? Well, you can hear immediately third, six, six, third. They're very consonant intervals. Then the bass moves before the top, then the bass, then together. So you can feel how that's duetting. The bass moving now, then the top, together, the bass, then the top. So there's this kind of rhythmic interaction as well as a bit of melodic interest going on there. So even though we said essentially this section is a continuum of semiquavers or 16th notes, we've also got some really quite interesting rhythmic character going on, particularly in the way that those two melodic lines kind of interplay. So now we're starting to think about melodic design, how we want to play it. We're also thinking about what's happening rhythmically there. We've really thought out what's happening structurally, so that's helpful. Let's have a look at the harmony, because the harmony is quite ambiguous. We're in the key of B minor. Okay, well, we can probably already see that there's a sense of starting in B minor, F sharp, D, B. Well, that belongs to the tonic chord. Then things blur a bit, which we'll come back to, but there's a sort of sense of starting in B minor. When we come to the cadence at the end of the section, well, we're finishing on an F sharp major chord. Well, have we modulated to F sharp major, or is it F sharp minor with the tierce to Picardy, or is it just the dominant chord of B minor? Well, these are all things we might want to think about. Let's go back to the beginning and start thinking this out harmonically, because it's a little bit of a teaser. As I say, you've got this B minor triad that spells out very clearly from the top of the triad, the fifth, the third, the root. What Brahms then does is he kind of extends that triad. Now, what's interesting about this, when we extend a triad, we normally extend it upwards. So we go root, third, fifth, then we go seventh, ninth, and then 11th and 13th. But what Brahms is doing here, he does extend it upwards at the end of the bar and the melody, but harmonically he also extends this triad downwards. So we get this B minor triad in the first bar, the first measure, then he comes down another third to G. So what starts life as a B minor triad then becomes this sort of G major seventh thing, which is kind of a bit unusual, isn't it? It becomes a sort of 6/7 in the key of B minor. Then he goes a step further, extends it downwards further. So now we're looking at E minor 9. E minor 7, 9. So it's a really rich chord. And then he extends that B minor thing upwards to the A at the end of the first bar. So the kind of right hand is a B minor triad with a seventh, a kind of 1/7. But we've also got, by the end of the bar, all of the notes of E minor, 7, 9, 11. So it's a very rich chord, isn't it? So there's ambiguity in the harmony just looking at that first bar there, that first measure. But we can see how it started life as B minor, how that extends upwards to B minor 7, but also how you extend downwards to E minor with big extension on the chord there. So it's quite interesting how that generates its own kind of colour. Okay, now this is Brahms. It's a sort of thing, it doesn't sound like this, but it's a sort of thing that Debussy is going to do in, very short period of time from here. It's almost kind of a bit impressionistic, isn't it? It's kind of like, well, what is that chord? We kind of can work it out, but a little bit kind of blurry, isn't it, really? And this idea of extension chords, just hearing the colour of the chord and enjoying it. And it's slow and it's low dynamics. It's all those sort of little touches of impressionism in Brahms, different nation, belonging to the Romantic period, not trying to be impressionist, but actually it's a hint of things to come, isn't it? Interesting. Now, when we look at the second bar, the second measure, we see that the same kind of carry on is present here. He starts with this triad. Now that's an interesting triad, isn't it? Because in B minor, that's a chord 2. Then extending it down, by the time we get A, we're now hearing an A7 chord. Then it extends down to F sharp. So now we've got this F sharp minor with a 7th and a 9th. Then it comes down to D in the bass, but actually the F sharp releases to come down, the G releases to come down to F sharp. So we've really now ended up with this sort of D7 chord, this D major 7 chord. So it's an interesting thing how that happens, because what's the function between this bar and that bar? Actually, there isn't a lot of function, is there? Then we go on to the third bar, the third measure. Well, we're doing the same kind of thing again. We start with this F sharp minor triad. It's a sort of chord 5 in B minor. Though chord 5 often has an A sharp in it. It's A natural here. Doing the same trick again. Extend down, and then the top part moves at the end of the bar, the end of the measure. So it's quite interesting that you have this kind of sort of colour chords building exercise with extension of the chords in the first 3 bars, the first 3 measures, without a very kind of clear sense of harmonic function as we progress from bar 1 to bar 2 to bar 3. So very interesting kind of futuristic design, but kind of very mysterious, isn't it? Now, Brahms is saying, make the most of all this. Take it slowly, kind of milk every note, enjoy every single note, enjoy every single chord, enjoy every single bar. Take your time over it. So the listener has got some chance of kind of getting hold of this melodic line, but also getting hold of this harmony. Now, does that help us to sort of think out, well, how are we going to do this? That will be one way of doing it. You might think, a bit too much for me. That's fine. But, Brahms is encouraging us in that letter to Clara Schumann to kind of really milk it. And what I'm trying to do there is to present this thing one measure at a time, one bar at a time, while still maintaining a sense of melodic line over the top. And really painting this kind of mysterious harmony, these chords that just extend and extend and extend, without sensing any kind of function from one bar to the next. And keeping in mind that construction that we talked about of single bars. Our next bar is the chance to do something slightly different. The phrasing starts on the last B of this bar, draws us into the next bar. And now we've suddenly got something that's much more functional, because when you look at this, you think that's a 2/7 chord. This is a 1C, that's a 5, and it's sort of going on to a 1B chord. So all of this is kind of pretty non-functional. And then suddenly functional harmony, and we suddenly feel ourselves kind of rooted in B minor. So, and onto this. It's kind of like we've come home to B minor. In fact, if you listen to those first 3 bars and just stopped, would you think you're in B minor? I think pretty difficult to say that you are, actually. When you come to the 4th measure, the 4th bar, aha, now we're suddenly feeling B minor. He goes more strongly down a functional route. And of course, this is the 4th measure, the 4th bar. We're halfway through that first 8-bar statement, aren't we? So you might think, actually, I'm going to treat this bar slightly differently from the way I'm going to treat these. You know, three separate things going on there, and then maybe a sense of moving forwards a bit more there as we come into focus with the B minor thing. And you can hear that this is the moment where we start duetting with the bass as well. So lots of things change there, don't they? And then, you know, we've had this kind of pretty functional moment there. When you look at this, we've got another functional moment here where we've got, and it's really, you know, the same melodic line that we had here, but now we're in D major. Well, D major is the relative major key of B minor, the home key. So that's actually pretty functional stuff as well, isn't it? And again, we've got 1C here going to 5/7 in its last inversion, going to 1 in its first inversion. And this chord back here is a chromatic chord 2 in D major. Chromatic because it's using B flat instead of B natural. Now, that's all perfectly functional, and we feel this modulation to D major. Well, darker B minor to a slightly brighter D major. Can we kind of paint that move into a slightly brighter space? And at the same time, can we just spare a thought for this B flat? Because it's not a straightforward 2, 1, C, 5, 1, because we've got that chromatic note. It wants a bit of time just to milk that out before we go on to something more functional. So kind of trying to relate this stuff to that stuff, B minor, D major, little bit of a chromatic chord, you know, so we can begin to see how to deal with that. We've got some little kind of teasing out to do in the intervening bar as well. We've got this start with D in the bottom and the bass and F sharp at the top, so that's sort of feeling fairly straightforward, like chord 1 in B minor. But then these two notes just creep in. They feel like passing notes, but they haven't passed from anywhere. So it's a kind of like, actually, is it a B minor first inversion chord? Is it a D major chord that's got a 7th and a 9th in it? Well, could be either. Then we move on to this rather rich moment of a G major 7 chord. Then something that feels as if it's passing. It sort of does in the lower part, less so in the upper part. And then we get this lovely tension where that then resolves onto this kind of appoggiatura style. You know, it's just something that needs a bit of time. And then into the D major moment. And as we go in the established D major, the melody leaps up. We have this big leap up of a 6, and the kind of light turns on as we go into D major. So that's a pretty significant moment. Notice it's not the peak of Brahms's crescendo, but I think it's a pretty significant moment, isn't it? So hopefully you're beginning to see kind of the elements of this piece that are the clues to interpretation. How you interpret from here is entirely up to you. Because I think the key thing is, well, what are the things that are helping us to think out the interpretation? The background, that letter to Clara Schumann, absolute eye-opener, isn't it? It really gives us lots of clues. Thinking through what's happening melodically, what's happening rhythmically, what's going on in the harmony, which is very mysterious, isn't it? What's functional, what's less functional, what's kind of hinting at impressionism, what's kind of more traditional kind of romantic harmony in places like this, you know, a bit of a mixture of things going on there. What's happening in the texture? How does the structure work? You know, the 2 8-bar phrases, what's happening inside those 8-bar phrases? How do I need to focus the balance? What am I doing with tone? What am I doing with rubato? That paints all of these things. So you can come up with an interpretation. There's a lot more we could say just about that opening section. And then, of course, it kind of launches into a D major section, lots of chromatic color going on there, all sorts of interesting things go on. We could talk about it all day. But I hope just thinking about the opening bars of this beautiful intermezzo, Opus 119, number 1, just helps to tease out a bit of insight in terms of, well, what are the things that we need to think about for interpretation in general, for interpretation in the opening section of this piece. Well, if you've found this video helpful, let me invite you to the Music Matters website, www.mmcourses.co.uk. Lots of resources available to you there, lots of courses that you might find helpful in terms of developing your background musical skills to enhance your sense of interpretation. You might also like to come and join our Maestros group. Just click on Maestros on the homepage to find out more. We've got level 1, it's a kind of support level, all sorts of fun things, early access to videos, emojis, that kind of thing. Level 2, you keep all the level 1 benefits, but you have additional perks, including a monthly live stream. We're going to be doing stuff like we've done in this video frequently at the monthly live streams. You can join the live chat, ask questions, get involved in the discussion about things, have an hour of input, of solid teaching on stuff like this to kind of really get to grips with it. If you want to go further, sign up for level 3, where you have level 2 and level 1 benefits as well, of course, but you have access to discounts on the courses and access to another live stream every month. Very much more individual. You can submit your own recording of a performance. You can submit a composition, a harmony exercise, whatever you want to do. I'll give you one-to-one feedback on it. So it's very kind of personally organized. And live chat running throughout. So everybody kind of shares the material. We all share ideas, lots of comments, feedback from everybody. Very supportive. Great way to mix with other people from around the world engaged in this very exciting journey with the rest of us. Anyway, lots about Maestros there. You might be interested in that. www.mmcourses.co.uk.